Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our founder and president, Helga LaRouche. Today is January 22nd, 2020. There's a very interesting series of developments occurring in the town of Davos, Switzerland, where the annual meeting of billionaires getting together to talk about what has to be done to save the planet took a very interesting turn this week. And Helga, I know you were very intrigued by the differences between what was presented by people like Mark Carney and what was presented by Trump. So why don't we start with the whole green picture that was presented there?
Well, first of all, naturally, for people who are talking so much about democracy, this is a rather undemocratic event because you had about 3,000 top managers, CEOs, 190 billionaires who own together as much as 4.6 billion people. Now, I find it very undecent that some few individuals have accumulated so much wealth because, this enables them to try to buy the election like Bloomberg is trying to do, who's running now an impeachment campaign with advertisements against Trump, spending almost a billion of his own money. So anyway, but just to really point to this effect that this is actually an unreal setting. And I think the most important thing, apart from the fact that Mark Carney and Larry Fink from BlackRock and some others are coming out now openly, basically saying that they want to reshape international financing to completely prevent uh, firms which have any kind of CO2 uh, footprint to prevent them from having access to any kind of financing. In other words, going in a completely green financing direction. And then the USB, the Union Bank of Switzerland, said, calling on investors to invest now in green, not to wait until legislation is there. Now is the time to make the big buck on that. So there is actually an effort to impose by the central bankers, and this is what the whole Davos discussion is all about, to impose a green dictatorship. And as we have discussed many times in this program, this is not something having to do with environment or climate, but it has everything to do with population reduction. Because as we discussed many times, if you decarbonize the world economy, and if you go to non-nuclear, because most of these people are violent anti-nuclear as well, and you only go to energy flux densities which have a very low population potential, which can be maintained with it. What these people actually are pushing is a population reduction of several billion of people. Now, that's not so nice. And I think the other thing which I think is quite noteworthy about this Davos event is that what we have been saying all along, if you remember, we have been publishing pamphlets where we said that this whole CO2 reduction campaign is really about population reduction. It is now getting clear also what we have maintained, that this green movement is identical with the bankers' interest. And the form it takes is that, for example, there was a program in Dreisat, which is this German, Austrian, Swiss TV program on Davos, where the leadership of Greenpeace said, well, it was really wrong to fight against these elites. We should work with them to establish the green agenda. And also Micah White, who is one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement, in an interview with BBC said exactly the same thing, that it's no point in fighting the elite. One has to make an alliance with them to implement the green agenda. So what we have been saying all the time is that this whole apparatus has been in the interest of the big banks, of the oligarchical faction from the very beginning, but now they're coming out openly and outing themselves. And I think this is very, very incredible, because at the same time, when you have the whole social fabric already disintegrating, you have mass demonstrations against the austerity policy. And naturally, if you go into the green financing, prices will explode, the social ferment will explode. What you see with the general strike in France, with the German farmers. So this is a completely untenable situation. So I think from that standpoint, the Trump speech, which naturally caused the biggest hysterical reactions by all the media, is actually worth to look at more closely. Naturally, there was a lot of, what you could call campaign speech, what Trump said. But I think, if people actually look what he said, and I would encourage people to really read it and listen to it, because it is, at least in parts of his speech, he presented things which come from a completely different axiomatic background. He was attacked for it. People said, the media said he was pointless. He tried to spread pointless optimism. Well, what he actually said is quite remarkable in this section where he referred to the incredible breakthrough which the Cathedral of Florence represented. That the people who were building this cathedral in the 15th century, which took 140 years, that they in the beginning did not know what technology they would use, but they had confidence that they would solve this problem, and that basically, that the builders of the Florentine Dome represent this specific human ingenuity to solve all problems. And then he said about what the cathedrals, he said, the cathedrals of Europe can teach us to pursue big dreams, to build what will endure after we have long gone. So in a clear reference to immortality. He said, this demonstrates the power of ordinary people to reach extraordinary achievements when they are united by a grand and noble purpose. Now, who has been talking about these things? I mean, you just showed the pictures. Please put them up again. These are books this is a book written by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, The Science of Christian Economy, which he wrote when he was innocently put in prison. And as you can see, you have the picture of the Dome of Florence. And my husband always pointed to the breakthrough in architecture, which was accomplished by this dome, namely that Brunelleschi, who was the architect of the dome, used the catenary, a completely different method of construction, where you don't use any kind of either cement or any kind of glue of any kind, but it is only through the weight of the cupola, based on the principle of the catenary. So this was a big breakthrough in architecture, and it's one of the if not the image of the Golden Renaissance, which really separated two completely different axioms of thinking, namely the Middle Ages and modern times. This was the beginning of technological breakthroughs, of urban life, of really a complete transformation of Europe. And if you look at the world population curve, we have used that curve, showing that the population increase really started with the Golden Renaissance, the Florentine development, as that which separated the more limited oligarchical system from the modern urban life, the modern nation state, as a positive example of what technology can do. Now, it is quite noteworthy that on the other side, Al Gore used a very similar population curve to basically say that the Renaissance really was the beginning of the evil, because it was science and technology which caused all these terrible population growth developments. But here you have it. I mean, this, I think, goes to the absolute essence of, what is the difference of a bestial point of view of man, a bestial image of man, where you regard each human being just as an additional parasite and a burden to nature, and the whole philosophy of the green climate movement. And I think from that standpoint, if you think about it, that first of all, I don't know if Trump is reading the books of LaRouche. I don't know. Maybe he does. Maybe he has a good speechwriter. I have no idea how this conception came in there. But then also to refer to the cathedrals of Europe as something which is uplifting people, making them look up and leaving something behind, which long endures after we are gone. I mean, this is a beautiful reference to the question of immortality, and also the idea that people can accomplish anything if they unite for a good plan. I mean, this is almost a quote from Friedrich Schiller from the introduction of The Fall of the Netherlands, where Schiller says exactly the same thing. So the reason why these quotes are extremely important, because they come from a completely different conception of man. They come from a different conception about the uh, role of science and technology. And it also shows why, why the Western oligarchical establishment is so absolutely freaked out about Trump, because this is the paradigm which they had tried to eradicate for, I mean, at least since, since really the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. They had, when it came back in a little bit with Kennedy and even a little bit less with Clinton, they tried to completely stamp out that image of man. And everything which went in the wrong direction with the Bush administrations and the Obama administration, what we discussed many times, stems from that. I mean, the foreign interventionist wars, the confrontation against Russia and China, the effort to build a unipolar world, which only creates privileges for the elites and small elites at the expense of the backwardness of the population. I mean, that is why they are so freaked out about Trump. Now, I'm not saying that Trump is, in all points like that, but I think, the fact that here you have a president of the United States knowing who he is talking about, the creme de la creme of this oligarchical principle, and he is saying things which, I know people will now have a heart attack when I'm saying this, but almost, demonstrates that he has an impulse of being a Renaissance man. Now, I think this is quite noteworthy, and I would, before people have a complete, roller coasters and hysterical reactions about what I'm saying, please think about it. I mean, here you have somebody who is practically appealing or referring to the best traditions of Europe as something, which has an enormous meaning. And just to say one other thing, when he said that the people who built the cathedral in Florence, even if they didn't have the technology yet when they started to build it, that they pursued it, being confident that they would solve the problem. Now, that is the same spirit which Schiller also expresses in a little poem of his called Columbus, where he basically said Columbus also, when he started to sail, he did not know what he would find, but he was confident that there was a cohesion between the ideas of the mind and what he would find in the physical universe. So there is a coherence in all of these things. And this is a side of Trump, which I think in particular, people in Europe, in the rest of the world, who only get negative coverage about the media should really start to reflect upon, because this is something positive to build on. So I want to encourage you to think about it.
Well, let me just add a slight point to that, which is that it was deliberately provocative given who he was speaking to, because these billionaires who were there are pushing a policy, this green financial policy, which is to create a new financial bubble for them and their friends, the 1% of the wealthy. And at the same time, they're spreading the pessimism. They're the ones who fund the fake science. And to say that Trump was pointlessly optimistic, I think one of the things that he said early in his speech was we must reject the perennial prophets of doom and their predictions of the apocalypse. And he said, these are the heirs of yesterday's foolish fortune tellers who want us to do badly. So I think this contradiction between the two worldviews is extremely important, Helga. And I think it does reflect something that hardly anyone in the world gets to see because of the crazy coverage. Now, in that context, here you have these billionaires meeting, talking about imposing new taxes, carbon neutral policies. So far, I haven't seen a word about the financial crisis, which is accelerating as they're sitting up in these snow-covered mountains. What do you have new on the situation with the financial system?
Well, there were some reports that this was actually a topic in Davos, that, many people were talking about the next crisis to come. And, it is now coming very clear that, this money pumping, the repo credits the Federal Reserve is giving, um, this was triggered. We were told this by some sources in the financial sector, that, last September, there were one or more mega banks about to go under. And this coincided with the Europeans and the Chinese stopping to buy short-term US treasuries. And this is when the Federal Reserve started to step in with the repo credits, with the money pumping. And, several people are really absolutely warning. We mentioned Jim Rogers the last time, but there were several others who basically say this is going to end up in an absolutely horrible way. And naturally, that is the big Achilles heel of Trump, because in his speech, both in the speech and also in a press conference he gave, he kept saying, how beautiful the US economy does, the stock market being at a record high. Kudlow, who was with him at the press conference, also reiterated the same thing. But naturally, if this financial system blows anywhere during the election campaign, I think this is the one thing which really, not only would mean no re-election for Trump, but it would also mean a terrible danger for the whole world economy. Now, one thing I should mention, at this press conference, Trump also said that what he will do next is to start to negotiate a trade deal with the European Union, and that this will be much tougher than with China. Now, I can imagine that the media reaction and the politicians in Europe, who already were completely, I mean, almost everybody attacked Trump after his Davos speech like never before, that this will fuel the anti-Trump hysteria in Europe, and it can really get very ugly. And given the fact that we are in the most incredible period, I mean, the impeachment is going on, then you will have these largest NATO maneuvers since the end of the Cold War for 4 months. The name of the maneuver is Defender Europe 2020. You will have simultaneous maneuvers in the Pacific. These maneuvers will be big. There will be almost 40,000 soldiers coming, half of them coming from the United States. Then tanks and other vehicles will be transported. with these soldiers to the Baltics, to Poland, some also to the Balkans. And this is an unbelievable escalation, you know, a very dangerous situation if you have the coincidence of the pending financial crash, a confrontation with Russia and China, because the problem maneuvers, as everybody knows, you know, you never know when a maneuver where you have already large amounts of troops and tanks and other vehicles in motion, when the border is being crossed from a maneuver to reality. So I think, you know, all of this underlines the urgent need to change the paradigm. We don't need a trade war between Europe and the United States. I don't think we need these maneuvers. I think what we need is a completely different approach. And, you know, I have proposed in reaction to the assassination of the Iranian general Soleimani, that there must be urgently a summit between the presidents of the three most important countries, Russia, China, and the United States, and a new development perspective for the world has to be adopted. Because if you remain in the geometry of geopolitics or geoeconomics, as now the European think tanks are calling it, the danger is that you can have, in this period of heightened tension, something going wrong. And that's why all people who are for peace should help the Schiller Institute to fight for the solution. And the solution has to be global Glass-Steagall, a credit system, national banks in every country, and then a cooperation for joint projects. The large picture, people have to really understand that if you remain within the game as it is right now, the danger that it will get out of control and that we are sleepwalking into a new uncontrollable global confrontation is absolutely there.
And you've mentioned several opportunities, in addition to your call for the Three Presidents Summit, that there could be a gathering at the Elba where you have the commemoration of the end of World War II with the American and Russian soldiers meeting. And then on the 9th of May, President Putin has invited President Trump to come to Moscow. Now, as you pointed out, all of this is going on in the midst of this impeachment trial in the US Senate. Do you have any thoughts on that? It began yesterday. The press is filled with mindless speculation, but it still looks very much as it has from the beginning, as just an attempt to stop Trump. What are your thoughts on it, Helga?
Well, we will have to see, you know. It's in a certain sense unpredictable, because if you look at the facts, Trump in his press conference said that, you know, nothing in the Ukraine transcript is lending itself as a cause for impeachment. And I think this is absolutely true. The fact that he has now Dershowitz and Kenneth Starr as some of his lawyers for this trial is very interesting, because both of them are not Trump people. They both are Democrats, but I think they both are defending the Constitution and think this whole thing is a total threat. Dershowitz has said as much. He said, if the Democrats get ahead with this procedure, it will be a coup against the Constitution of the United States, because it will turn the United States from a presidential system into a British style of parliamentarian system. And naturally, this would be very bad, because if you look at the parliamentarian systems in Europe, they just don't function. You have now almost ungovernability in many countries, because if you have, you know, many parties in the parliament, they have to form coalitions of 3, 4 parties, which means no principles anymore and just holding on to power. So I don't know how this will end up. You know, it can be a short trial. Trump himself said if it's going to be a long trial, which has the advantage that, you know, the Republicans could bring in a lot of witnesses, which could shed light to the origins of this whole impeachment, which is a continuation of the coup against Trump. But Trump also said it would be very bad for the country if it's a dragged out a trial. So, I mean, you have all these developments going on at the same time. The military confrontation with the maneuvers, the financial crash, the impeachment. So I think people really have to start thinking that you have to change the agenda. You have to establish a completely new paradigm, non-geopolitics. You have to establish the common aims of mankind. And, based on the principle of sovereignty, I think if you think back to Trump's speech at the UN General Assembly, where he said every country has the absolute right for sovereignty, every country has the right to celebrate their own culture. And that's actually what Putin is saying, what Xi Jinping are saying. And I think this return to the principle of sovereignty and then have an alliance of perfectly sovereign republics for a common aim of mankind. This is the policy of John Quincy Adams, and that is the policy of the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. So the way out is very clear, but I think it needs a breakthrough and an emergency summit on the level of Xi Jinping, Putin, and Trump remains what needs to be done.
There was a summit this last Sunday in Berlin on Libya, which included a number of these leaders. Do you think that's a step in the right direction?
Well, I think it is. However, I mean, it is a step in the right direction insofar as Merkel did invite President Putin. And I think that as such is a good sign because, it reflects the recognition that you cannot solve any problem, let it be Syria or Iran or Libya or any other problem, if you do not include uh, Russia and President Putin. So that was positive. This Libya summit was the result of 5 months of negotiations involving Russia, involving Turkey. But naturally, I think we are very far from either realizing the ceasefire. It's not yet clear how to enforce it, how to enforce the weapons embargo. But I think there was one element which I think really needs to be changed if there is to be a solution. There was no word on the side of Merkel or the side of any Europeans on the question of economic development. And while the summit was going on, they had many TV programs showing the refugee camps in Libya, which Pope Francis had called concentration camps a couple of months ago. And I think this is absolutely a correct characterization because you could see huge camps practically, in the field, in the mud, uh, where no hygiene, no toilets, no room. People were there like animals in camps. So the idea to just stabilize Libya and then build better camps is obviously also very cynical, because if it does not include eliminating the causes for the refugee crisis, namely to have an industrialization of all of Africa, including Northern Africa, this problem will get worse. And the situation with the refugees on the Greek island is equally horrendous. So what we need is a completely different economic approach. We need the new Silk Road, cooperation with Russia, China, India, Japan, other nations to industrialize Africa. Naturally, the Europeans should play a role in that, but that would mean that they have to give up their colonial thinking and their idea that you prevent the development by sustainable technologies, which we have seen what they are. They mean a shovel in the hand of everybody and a little well in every village. That is not what is required. What is required is large infrastructure projects as a precondition for industrial development. But naturally, if you look at the agenda in Davos, that is the last thing these people want. So, I think we need to really rethink that, and we need to increase the number of people who start to go back to physical economy, who go back to science and technology, to fundamental universal principles, and recognize from that standpoint that this entire green agenda is not based on science, it's not based on real laws of the universe, but it's completely ideological, and it is population reduction. So I think the contradiction between, physical economy, building the condition for mankind to have a sustainable development, which means population growth. There is a need for the population to become larger for the very reasons developed by my husband, because of the relative potential population density concept. So I think that this is a fight where ideology and reality are going to clash more and more, as we saw it with the tractor demonstrations in Germany, which, you had thousands and thousands of tractors, of farmers, who make the point that with the present policies, they cannot survive, clashing with the Friday for Future demonstrations, which basically demand a complete stop to any production, or as Greta said, any CO2 emission has to stop right now. I mean, this is completely unrealistic, and I think we have to go back to the idea of, that the economy is there for people to grow, to develop, and to do beautiful things, like building the cathedrals in all of Europe in the past centuries, and apply that same principle for the future.
Well, on that last point, your husband had often spoken of the space program as the kind of impetus that was behind the cathedral movement in Europe during the pre-Renaissance and Renaissance period. Since we last spoke, we know a little bit more about the Phase 1 agreement with China. The Chinese have a continued commitment with the Belt and Road initiative, to rebuild countries that have been destroyed by war. What can you say of what you see from President Trump and Xi Jinping, the agreement that was signed last week?
Well, I think it's good. Trump, in his press conference just now, said that in the process of the negotiations, it was about to become very nasty, but now the two countries are friends again. I think both sides expressed, satisfaction with the agreement of this Phase 1. But there are also many Chinese economists who are quite concerned that if there is not a fundamental change, that almost a decoupling between the US and Chinese economy is still an absolute danger. So I'm carefully optimistic, but I don't think the problem has been solved, because, as I said, the Achilles heel is the belief that the stock market, actually, it's an asset inflation, which you see. It's not a characteristics of a booming economy. So as long as that problem is not resolved and really replaced by a completely new credit system and a new approach, I don't think this problem is solved. However, I think there are promising signs. There will be some meetings between NASA and Chinese space people, and the Chinese have a very ambitious space program for this year. They will have 40 launches, among them Chang'e 5, bringing back samples from the moon. And President Trump has, after all, put the Artemis program on the agenda. So he has an impulse to build the new cathedrals for the present time. But, I think it requires really a mobilization of all of you to help us to get this new paradigm, because, there are many, many factors working, and mankind is not yet safe. But we need the looking up to the stars, which is the equivalent of looking up in the cathedral, to be uplifted and to remind ourselves that man is a creative creature, that we are the creative species in the universe, and that we, if we are conscious about that, can really solve all problems if we are uniting for a good plan, as Trump was saying. And I can only agree with him on that.
Well, as you can see from this last half hour or so of our discussion, it's an extremely dense and intense moment in politics. This is the time for people to join the Schiller Institute and take part in our activities. Go to our website and help build the audience for this webcast. Get this out as widely as possible. So, Helga, with that, I think we've come to the end. Any final comments?
Well, I think, it's a time to go back to science, technology, and the beauty of great art. We are in the Beethoven year, and I can only advise you, listen to as much Beethoven as you can, preferably good performances like Furtwängler performances, and be uplifted, because I think this is a period where people have to have an internal source of strength, and classical music is the most easy, the thing which is most easily accessible. So think like Beethoven, and then you have a good chance that we get all together out of this incredible situation with a positive outcome.
Spread optimism. Okay, Helga, so we'll see you next week.
Okay, till next week.